When I first came to ESP, I had on the surface something that seemed to be like the perfect life, or a pretty good life. Like superficially, materialistically, I was very successful. And when I came to ESP and I started to do the work in the Goals Lab, do the work in the classes, and now that's my life, that's my reality. I have an experience of my family that is nothing but joy, and it's astounding.
Keith and Allison, January 9th, 6:59 a.m. talking about branding the wall.
Do you think the person who's being branded should be completely nude and sort of held to the table like a sort of almost like a sacrifice?
People were constantly being manipulated. They were constantly being controlled.
I was falling asleep. He reached over and touched my face, kind of making a pass.
Shortly thereafter, Melita recalls losing her virginity at age 15.
We give things meaning. Justice is something we earn.
And the person should ask to be branded. Should say, please brand me, it would be an honor, or something like that.
Once you've seen the photograph, yeah, it's K.R. Keith Raniere. This is not what you do to human beings, unless you think you own them.
Keith started Jeunesse, which was a women's group. It was going to help you be more successful in life, be a more successful human being within yourself. That's what I thought it was designed to do.
Raniere wanted to destroy me. It was either me or him. My goal was to expose NXIVM.
So I've done a lot of true crime topics on this channel, but the one that has always interested me the most was cults. I feel like the idea of just a person, same as you and me, who takes control of a group of people, manipulates them, brainwashes them, mind controls them, and they're usually already broken down people, and they can basically just make this group of people believe or do whatever they want them to. And it's not like it's just one person either. It's usually a group of people. It's so extremely hard to snap yourself out of it because you are truly the only one in control of doing that, because everyone else around you is also getting brainwashed and mind controlled and encouraging this sort of mentality. I've only done a couple of cult videos on my channel, but the ones that I have done. Like, I talked about them. I was on Reddit and I found about this cult called NXIVM. And NXIVM, for those who don't know, started out as just a typical MLM. If you don't know what an MLM is, they basically go door to door selling products, and the more products you sell, you get a commission from that. But also, if you recruit members into the MLM, you also get a commission for that. And so that's what NXIVM started out with, but they weren't going door to door selling products. They were actually selling programs. And these programs were said to be self-help, self-improvement, and enlightenment, kind of like live the life you deserve today. This MLM would soon just be a front organization for a sex trafficking cult. There is so much to unpack when it comes to this cult, and there is a lot to go through, so I'm just gonna hop right into it. Also, by the way, hi, if you don't know who I am, my name is Hailey Elizabeth. I post true crime videos once a week on my channel, so if you're interested in any of that, you can subscribe, and if not, totally chill. If you just want to vibe and go, vibe and go. So NXIVM was created in 1998 by a man named Keith Raniere and his wife / co-founder Nancy Salzman. A little bit of backstory on Keith Raniere. He was born on August 16th, 1990 to his mom Vera and his dad James in Brooklyn, New York. His dad was an advertising executive and his mom was a ballroom dancer. And as for his childhood, Keith lived a pretty good childhood. He was an only child, so his parents gave him lots of love and attention. And even Keith himself would go on to say that he lived a pretty nice childhood. He did say that his mom drank a bit, but it was never excessive. And as a child, Keith was described to be a natural-born leader. He would spark conversations with anyone and become friends with anyone. But at around 8 years old, that kind of changed when his parents got a divorce, and so he had to move from Brooklyn, New York to Suffern, New York, where he lived with his mom. After this divorce, he became very quiet and very reserved, but although Keith was very quiet and reserved, he didn't really want to be in his bubble. He wanted to go out there and make friends, and so he started to read books on how to make friends. But instead of reading books like self-help or self-improvement, he started reading books such as Isaac Asimov's Mind Control and another book called Second Foundation, which is another mind control book. And he was reading these mind control books at just 12 years old. And at 12 years old, not only was he reading mind control books, but he was also teaching himself 3 different languages with all of his alone time. And then as a teenager, he got a job with a company called Amway. And Amway was a very popular MLM at the time, and he basically just went door to door selling supplements. And it was through Amway where Keith would start to learn the ins and outs of MLMs, and this was also perfect for Keith because, as I said, he had a really good way of talking to people. He could spark conversations and become friends with anyone, but he also kind of took it as practice, sort of, on how to manipulate people into buying something they don't need. After high school, that's when Keith went to Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York, graduated at 22 with a 2.2 GPA and barely passing. Now, the thing about Keith is that Keith was insanely intelligent. As I said, he was reading mind control books and he learned 3 languages at just 12 years old. So he was really, really smart, but he never applied himself to college. And that's because Keith never really showed up to class. He never did tests. He never did homework. And so naturally his grades fell. And the reason why he was never at class was because he was actually working on his own business / MLM called Consumer Byline. But after college, that's when he got a job as a computer programmer for the New York State Division of Parole. Keith was also said to be in the Mega Society. Now, if you guys don't know what the Mega Society is, the Mega Society is a society of people that have only 1 in 1 million of an IQ. But in order to be entered into the society, you have to take what's called a mega test. And this mega test will prove if you have a 1 in 1 million IQ. And apparently Keith was in this group. One of the members of the group even said that Keith, along with 2 other people, a woman named Marilyn Voss Savant and a man named Eric Hart, were one of the highest scoring members. So although Keith was extremely smart, he sort of used his intelligence for evil. And then in 1990, at the age of 30 years old, that's when he finally got Consumer Byline off the floor and he started getting employees. And at the time, it was actually said to be one of the fastest growing MLMs. But with Consumer Byline, they weren't going door to door selling specific products, but they were actually selling memberships for people to get their everyday products at a lower price. So it basically supplied you with coupon codes or actual coupons. And one of the people hired into this MLM was a woman named Tony Natalie. Now, when Tony and Keith first met, they immediately hit it off. They started dating and then shortly got married after only a couple months of dating. Tony was previously married with a child, but she had actually just recently got divorced. And then in 1993, 3 years after Consumer Byline was made, they suffered a rapid decline, and that was because they were following a lawsuit that was filed by the state of New York, who stated his company was a pyramid scheme. And other than that, the lawsuit really went no further. Keith just got rid of his business, but the next year in 1994, he would start his second MLM business and call this one National Health Network. But this time he wasn't selling like things at a lower price. This time he was selling supplements and weight loss pills. But in 1996, 3 years later, he was caught once again for this MLM, and he not only had to pay a $40,000 fine, but he also had to sign a paper saying that he, quote, wasn't allowed to be promoting, offering, or granting participation in a chain distribution scheme. Now, Keith was supposed to pay $40,000, but he only ended up paying $9,000 because he claimed that he didn't have the money for it, which was kind of crazy because Keith was constantly always bragging to people how he had a multi-million-dollar business, and I honestly believe it because Keith's business had employees in 25 different states, and not only that, he was also being investigated in all of those 25 different states simply just for ripping people off. Because surprise, these weight loss pills didn't actually work. So he only paid the $9,000 up front, but he still owed the rest of the state $31,000. His wife Tony was kind of left with no direction. Their family had literally lost all of their money, and so in this depressed state, she went to her best friend Nancy Salzman to comfort her. Nancy Salzman was actually a nurse, this, and Tony was kind of just ranting to Nancy about all of this. And Tony tells Nancy, you know, you're a nurse. Why don't you sit in a room with Keith, you know, just talk to him, get to know him, and let me know what you think of him. Like, do you think he's crazy? Do you think there's something wrong with him? Or is there something wrong with me? And so Nancy is like, okay, yeah, like I can definitely do that. So Nancy goes to meet with Keith, and Tony said that Nancy came back 4 days later with a glazed look in her eye and told Tony, quote, "You don't know him. He's gonna change the world. He's light years ahead of us." And shortly after this, Keith and Tony got into a divorce, and Keith and Nancy started dating. Once they started dating, they actually went into business together because Keith had a background of sales, so he knew how to talk to people. And ironically, Nancy was not just a nurse, but she was a practitioner of hypnotism and neurolinguistics programming, specifically second best in all state of New York. So they made their first business, and they called this one Venery Management Systems, and it was basically a program that people can take for self-enlightenment and self-improvement. But when they pitched this company to a lot of like investors, they weren't really getting the response they wanted due to Keith's past. Keith's entire past is literally a bunch of red flags. Like, he has been known for ripping people off, he owes money to the state, he's known for scamming people. And so since Venery Management Systems was getting a lot of flack, that's when they decided to change the name to NXIVM, which is actually the name of a specific power in a video game that Keith played, where the description of the power is, quote, "Destruction of one's enemies increases one's own power." So now let's get into the actual cult. How did this MLM go sideways? How did a man who has been practicing mind control and brainwashing since he was 12 years old, and a woman who is second best in her state for hypnotism, how did this company go sideways? So NXIVM was the actual company that Keith and Nancy owned, but within this company, they sold a program called ESP, which stood for Executive Success Programs. And so once they started to hire people on, these people went door to door, and they would even like stop people in shopping malls or outside of stores and introduce them to the ESP program, which was set up to be a program taught by Keith for self-enlightenment, to live the life you deserve, get you out of that slump and start living again. And in this case, Keith really couldn't get in trouble because although he wasn't allowed to do like pyramid schemes anymore, this really wasn't a pyramid scheme. He's not selling a product that, you know, wouldn't work, like false advertisement. He's literally just selling advice, and you can't really get in trouble for that. But this ESP program was not cheap. These programs were very, very expensive. So within this ESP program, there's 3 different levels. The first level is a 5-day program for $2,700. The second level is an 11-day program for $5,100. And the third level, which was ironically highly recommended, was 16 days for $7,600. And they said and put very big emphasis on if you chose the third level, it was only for the people who were like really dedicated and like really wanted to change themselves. Kind of manipulating their customers into thinking that if you choose the cheaper one, you're not as like dedicated to yourself. And you would think if you're paying nearly $10,000 for this program, it would be like life-changing, riveting. What you would do, literally, you would sit down in a rented out ballroom of a hotel, and there was like a big box TV in front of everyone, and Nancy was standing next to it, and she would literally pop in VHS tapes of Keith speaking while like everybody watched and took notes. Keith wasn't even there to teach the class. It was literally a VHS tape. So not only would you watch these VHS tapes, but they would also give you homework to do every day, and they would call this homework integrate. So basically their idea is that if you want, for example, to strive to a different career and you really, really want this specific career, if you work at that career a little bit every single day, you you will then integrate with that person that you have in your head. They would basically tell people, think of something you want, think about the life that you want to live, and every single day do something little that represents that life. And when people did that, of course they would see results because they were consistently being held accountable for becoming the person that they want to come. And when someone's over your shoulder telling you what to do and how to push yourself, of course you're going to get to where you want to be. And integrating wasn't just homework, but integrating also went internally too. And they described integrating as a technique where you took your fears, phobias, limiting beliefs, and even medical conditions and cured them completely and promised to never have it come back. But these people didn't see it as them doing the work. They saw it as like, oh, Keith and Nancy are the reason that I am where I'm at today. They also created this system called rational inquiry, where basically Keith and Nancy would look at your life and tell you how to fix it to their standard. So if you were completely comfortable with your life, but Keith and Nancy look at your life and they don't like it, they will literally tell you what to do on how to fix it so it's pleasing to them. And so that's kind of where the cult behavior started. The more Keith and Nancy got that attention from people, the more they started to harness it a little bit more. So most of the people that entered never really finished because the program was so expensive. And once you pay, like for example, the $7,600 for the 16-day program, that isn't the only fee that you have to pay. Once they have you paying, they will continuously drain you of all of your money. They will begin giving you all of these fees, and if you want to see this extra program, then you have to pay an extra fee. Or if you want to know more and expand your mind, you have to pay this amount. The program also gave out sashes to its members. So if you had a silvery blue sash, that means you were like the top of the group, and the only people that had silvery blue sashes was Keith and Nancy. And if you had an orange sash, that means you were a new member, you just got there, and you're kind of lower on the rank. And there's also colors in between silvery blue and orange, and all of those colors represent you inching your way up to silvery blue. So as you can see within this, self-improvement program, they've also implicated social ranks. Keith had even named himself, quote, vanguard leader of the philosophical movement, and Nancy had named herself, quote, head of the school. I am all about self-improvement. I am all about self-care as long as it is healthy and it is for you. I feel like, some parts of self-enlightenment and spirituality, like I really do believe in that stuff. So it's not that I'm concerned with. It's the fact that you have to pay in order to get there. You continuously have to pay. And then on top of that, there's also social ranks. And so if you go down in a rank, is also displayed to everyone else. So everyone else can see if you are going backwards or forwards. And on top of that, everybody views Keith and Nancy as leaders. I mean, as I said, they're the only ones with the silvery blue sashes. So of course they're going to look to them for approval and guidance. And at that point, I feel like that's where it's extremely unhealthy. I feel like then you're not self-improving, you're just improving yourself for others. Keith was not seen as an inspiration. He was more seen as a god. And Keith would even tell people that he had mystical powers and that he can actually give some of his powers to people if they followed him. And as I said, Keith was extremely intelligent, and he was even said to be in the mega society. And so he had a really good way of manipulating people. But in return, Keith never actually cared about any of his people. He only cared about the attention and money that he could get out of them. And so then that's when Keith tried to recruit people like celebrities, billionaires, entrepreneurs. And a big name in NXIVM was a director named Mark Vincent. He was the director of a documentary series called The Vow on HBO Max, as well as another documentary called What the Bleep Do We Know? When Mark entered into NXIVM, he actually entered in with his friend, Sarah Edmonton, who was a Canadian actress. Sarah had played the role of Callie in the Bratz Kids Sleepover Adventure, as well as Lena in Bratz Fashion Pixies. She also played the voice of Courtney in the Barbie Diaries. And as you can tell from all of the shows that she's been on, she has been on kid shows. But Sarah, at this point in her life, just really wanted a grown-up job. She kind of wanted something a little bit more adult-like. And so she was in this transitional period when she decided to go on a cruise with her husband, happened, and that's when she met Mark Vincent. Her and Mark get to talking, and that's when Mark introduces NXIVM to Sarah and also explains their ESP program. Now, Sarah already looked up to Mark Vincent because he was a successful director and she was a struggling actress. And at the time, Sarah actually had a cough that she couldn't get rid of. And so Mark asks her the question, quote, "What do you have to lose if you lose the cough?" And Sarah said that she didn't really know what that meant in the moment, but after that, she realized that she didn't actually have a cough, but she was pretending to have a cough because she associated being sick with getting attention, because everyone pays attention to you and takes care of you when you're sick. And during that time, she was also going through a very rough patch with her husband. And so that is why she was coughing, because she wasn't getting attention from her husband. So she was seeking attention elsewhere. Now, is this actually true? I have no clue. This is just what Sarah had told herself. And she realized this. She said that her cough completely went away and it amazed her. And so she went back to Mark to learn a little bit more about NXIVM and the ESP program. But unfortunately, Sarah didn't have the money for it, so she just did the 5-day program for $2,700. But as I said, that first fee is not the only fee you're gonna pay. Once you're in, you are hooked, and that's exactly what happened to Sarah. Her and Mark started to grow in their ranks very, very quickly, which made them feel good about themselves, and then in return, they want to keep on staying there and spending more money. And NXIVM actually grew so successful with all of their members that they even opened up a location in Vancouver to network to people out there as well. Over time, NXIVM expanded, and it even started to recruit celebrities, big celebrities such as Kristen Cruick from Smallville and Snow White, Allison Mack, who was ironically Kristen Cruick's co-star on Smallville. Allison Mack had learned about NXIVM through Kristen Cruick, so the both of them were in there, as well as Catherine Oxenberg from Dynasty, who had roped her daughter India in as well. So in order to remain in NXIVM, there were requirements. Not only did you have to give all of this money to them, but it was also a requirement for a member to recruit at least one member a month. And if they didn't do that, they would be kicked out. And so, as I said, most people just couldn't afford it, or they cut their losses and they left. But a lot of the people that had a lot of money, such as the celebrities, stayed for long periods of time. And Allison Mack was one of those people that saw Keith like a god. She looked up to him. She was so inspired by him.
So when someone's being authentic, you get the feeling that not only that there's a person there in the moment, but somehow you reach into their very essence and you meet a unique individual.
I don't know why, that makes me want to cry. It's beautiful.
Well, I think these are all things that we strive for. You know, we strive as individuals, we strive to break through a type of existential isolation. We want to touch someone. We want to know that other people have souls. We want to experience this. We want to experience connection.
But Keith actually controlled Allison's entire life. He controlled what she thought. He controlled what she believed. He also counted her calories to make sure she stayed a specific weight. He made her take a vow of devotion to only him for the rest of her life. And Allison would go on to say that during this time, she barely slept because she was expected to be on call and right by Keith's side 24/7, no matter what time it was. Now, Mark didn't just rope in Sarah, he also roped in his wife Bonnie into NXIVM, and Bonnie was the only one who saw right through this scam. She definitely saw this as a cult. She knew right from the start that there was something really weird about this. Keith would not only just count the calories of Allison either, he would count the calories of most of the women that entered into this cult, and because of that, Bonnie grew very weak, very malnourished, she barely slept, and if she wasn't putting in 100% of her 100% of the time, she would be kicked out. And so Bonnie tries to confide in Mark and tell him everything that's going on with her, but Mark then tells her that she's not feeling tired, that she's not weak, she's not overworked. It's simply because she was, quote, letting her limiting beliefs get to her, not trying hard enough because she doesn't want it enough. And for a while, Bonnie actually believed this. Bonnie thought that maybe it was her limiting beliefs that were doing all of this this to her, but over time, she snapped out of it and started to realize what exactly was going on. This was definitely not just self-improvement and self-care, as they put it, because Bonnie said that Keith would kiss everyone on the lips, no matter what the age was. He would also kick out people instantly if they disagreed with him or stood up to him. He only saw people as numbers and not actual people, and he didn't care how in debt these people were. They needed to give him more money or else they would be kicked out. And when you are in that position needing approval from Keith, you literally have no other option but just to give him money. Bonnie decided to leave and divorce Mark, but when she did, it was a disaster. She said that she had people all throughout the night blowing up her phone so she couldn't sleep, people from inside NXIVM. Her marriage with Mark went downhill, and she tried to tell Mark, you know, this is a cult. What are we doing here? Like, this is not right. Do you see what he's doing to people? But Mark just said that, you know, this isn't a cult, because cults are things like Charles Manson or the Heaven's Gate. This is all spiritual enlightenment. This is about bettering yourself. And shortly after Bonnie left, that's when a lot of other people were leaving as well. And people noticed that whenever people left, they never ever left on good terms. As I said, they were calling Bonnie in the middle of the night all night. And that's what they also did to other members who were leaving. Some of these members even had large fraudulent charges on all of their cards. Some of them had their medical insurance canceled randomly. And a number of them were also stalked by current members of the group. So after a while, NXIVM and the ESP program ended up getting a lot of flack. A lot of people just weren't doing it. They didn't want to do it. They heard bad things about it. And so Keith and Nancy decided to create a new program, and this program was called DOS. And DOS, which was DOS, stood for Dominus Obquidius Supremum, which literally translated to, quote, master over slave women. Keith would openly say that he believes that men and women are not equal. He believes that women have a role and men have a role, and there are specific things that women cannot do without a man. He just believes that women cannot function if they are not next to a man. He just viewed women as lost puppies, and without a man by their side, that's all they'll ever be. So this DOS program was literally just Keith and a bunch of women, but most of the women within this DOS program were already members of the NXIVM cult, but this program was very, very secretive. Even to learn more information about the group, you had to provide a fee, and this fee wasn't money. This fee was actually a secret. You basically had to tell them something that you've never told anyone before, or a secret that if it were to get out, your life would be completely over with. Keith and Nancy were basically just telling people, if you want to learn more about this group, give us blackmail. And then that's how we'll know that you're loyal and you're dedicated and you won't ever disobey us. Which basically what they're doing is that they want the blackmail, so in case they do leave, they can release it as revenge. So the leader of this DOS group was Allison Mack, because as I said, Allison Mack, besides Nancy, was Keith's right-hand man. And Mark ended up getting word about this DOS group, and even though he was the head director, he knew nothing about this group, and he started to get a really weird feeling. And so he calls Keith and he asks him like, oh, hey, I heard that there's this new program and it's called DOS. What is that? Like, I've never heard of it. And Keith basically just brushes it off and he says, oh, you know, it's just a thing that the girls are doing. Allison, she decided to create a little group. It's only for the girls, so I don't really know. I just greenlit it because I want them to have their own thing. But Mark knew from the first word that Keith was lying, because there is no way that Keith would just greenlight a whole entire group that he vaguely knew about. There's just no way, because he said that Keith is way smarter than that. And also, it was a girls only group. It would not be on Keith's brand to give women freedom like that. So already a red flag, something's going on. So that's when Mark made the decision to leave NXIVM, but before he left, he warned Sarah, and he basically just told her, I heard that this group, it's called DOS, you have to provide blackmail in order to be into it, and it's girls only, so if you hear about it, don't do it, don't do anything. And Sarah kind of replies kind of like, oh, really? I had no clue. That's crazy. but if I see it, I'll definitely I'll take note of it in that tone. And Mark already knew that Sarah knew about it and or she was possibly already in it. And so Mark just asks her straight up, are you in this DOS group? And that's when Sarah breaks down crying and she says, yes, I am in this group. And that's when she proceeds to show Mark above her pelvic area, there was a branding of Keith's initials burned into her skin with a hot iron. And that's when Sarah starts to explain what actually DOS was. Sarah said that when she first entered the group, in order to learn more information about it, she needed to provide blackmail. But Sarah said that all her life she was an open book. She lived pretty drama-free. There was nothing really bad in her life, like any secret that she kept. And so the person that approached Sarah about this group was a girl named Lauren, who was actually Nancy's daughter. So Lauren approaches Sarah about this group, but Sarah can't provide any blackmail. And so Lauren's like, okay, then just make something up. And so Sarah makes up this lie about how her ex-husband was very abusive and also abusive to their child, and also that she hated her parents, which was completely opposite to her life. Her ex-husband never did anything to her or her child, and she actually had a really good relationship with her parents. And Sarah describes that once she provided this blackmail, the group was kind of presented as a sorority group. The group was split up into 4 pods, and each pod had a pod leader, to which Sarah was actually a pod leader for one of them. And the pod leaders were to be referred to as sister, and all of the other people in the pod were referred to as sister slaves. And Sarah said that the pod leaders, or the sisters of each pod, would bring in more people, and the more people you bring in, the more of a possibility you have to move up to Grand Master. And the only people that were Grand Masters was Keith, Nancy, and Nancy's daughter Lauren. And although you have to give blackmail just to be in the group, once you are in the group, you have to provide more blackmail. And Sarah said that one day when she showed up to the group, she was forced to do a nude photo shoot, to which those pictures would be saved by Keith just in case she left and the blackmail that she gave wasn't good enough. They would be able to release these nude photos of her. And Sarah had to report to one of the Grand Masters. Most of the time it was Lauren. She had to report everything she did. She had to tell Lauren when she was eating, what she was eating. She even needed to ask Lauren permission if she could sleep. And then one day Lauren had approached Sarah and said that they were going to go on a girls trip to Vancouver. And so Lauren kind of set up this trip to be a fun girls trip where they're just going to get together, they're going to get to know each other, and they're going to get fun matching tattoos. But Sarah quickly realized that this retreat to Vancouver was not a fun girls trip, because immediately when she got there, she was blindfolded and driven to a random location to which she had to strip naked, still blindfolded, and then from there she was brought into a room and sat down. And as she was sitting down, that's when she heard a bunch of other people also walking into the room. And once all of these people had come inside, that's when they were instructed to take their blindfolds off. And that's when Sarah realizes that she's sitting in a circle of all of the women in her pod completely naked, and Keith was the only man in the room, and he was sitting right there in front of them also naked. And Keith said that the reason why they were all naked, this was a way to confront vulnerability, that it is our natural bodies and nothing to be ashamed of, so we should just be able to express ourselves. After this little speech he gave, they were all blindfolded again, and then they were brought onto a bus still naked, and then from that bus they went to Allison Mack's mansion in Vancouver, and that's when they started to get their tattoos. Sarah said that when it was her turn to go up, she was laying on a table, and above her pelvic area, that is when she felt a burning sensation. And they didn't give them pain medication, they didn't give them any numbing cream, it was pure pain. And Sarah said that this process lasted 30 minutes. And it wasn't until her blindfold was taken off that she saw what she was branded with. And from the right side up, it's supposed to represent the mountains, the water, and the sky, but when you turn your head to the side, it makes out the letters KR, which stands for Keith Raniere. And at this point is when Sarah had her wake up moment. As she's explaining all of this to Mark, she's finally realizing what she got herself into. And she's starting to realize that all of those women that she had recruited into the pod, they weren't being recruited into some women empowerment group. They were being recruited to be sex slaves for Keith. Sarah also said that Keith would often preach his philosophy about men and women and believed that men were designed genetically not to be monogamous and they must spread their seed, while women are designed to be monogamous. And Keith had, quote, a rotating group of 15 to 20 women with whom he maintained sexual relationships. And so Sarah reveals all of this to Mark, and Mark goes and confronts Lauren about this and says, what are you doing? Like, this is illegal. And once Lauren found out that Sarah had said something, Lauren confronted Sarah and said, why would you do that? This is exactly why we didn't want the men involved. They don't understand. And Lauren even attempted to manipulate Allison again and tell her, this is why we don't want men involved, because they don't understand. Mark is trying to fool you. He's holding you back from your true potential and he's giving you no support. DOS was very similar to ESP in that they were going out and recruiting specifically young women. They would go door to door, they would sit outside stores, they would go to the mall. But when they would pitch this group to like young girls, they would explain it to be like, oh, we're just girls having fun. We're like trying to lift each other up whilst getting a little spiritual. Like, they kind of set it up in a friendly way, which I think is absolutely terrifying, because I feel like when you're a woman, you usually seek women for comfort, and knowing that in reality what was going on, it's terrifying. Now, a big thing about entering into this group once you were actually entered in was your diet. The grandmasters had to have control over everything you ate, so you had to tell them when you're eating, what you're eating, the amount of calories, and you have to send a photo of what you're eating to one of the grandmasters, and you literally just have to sit there with your food and wait for them to respond and confirm if you could eat it or not. And for anybody that doesn't know, all of our bodies are completely different. There's only one of you that exists. Therefore, your body is like no other. We all digest food differently. And so the calorie limit for one person may not work for another person. And so due to all of this really, really heavy restricting on food, a lot of girls became very malnourished, sleep deprived. Some of their periods had either stopped altogether or became extremely irregular. Their hair started to thin and their skin also became translucent. These girls were just absolutely suffering because they weren't getting the nutrients they needed, but at the same time, they were young and vulnerable, and they were also surrounded by women that were going through the same thing. And so since it seemed normal, they thought what they were going through was completely fine. But a lot of the women that left this DOS group noticed a pattern with Keith, in that Keith loved women who were very, very thin, especially unhealthy thin. And Keith had even said that it's a fetish of his of having unhealthy, skinny women. Keith also hated women who felt good about themselves and women who were successful or assertive. And whenever he would come across a woman that felt good about themselves or felt successful, he would make them feel like they were being cocky and egotistical and basically strip down any pride that they had. And so when DOS was created, a lot of these long-term women who had basically all their self-love and self-respect stripped away from them, of course they were going to go wherever Keith went because they saw Keith as their validation and what they needed to feel good about themselves. But as I said, a lot of people left because a lot of people realized all of the abuse going on, and so that led to a lot of lawsuits. But Sarah and her sister Claire, because Sarah had also brought her sister Claire into this, them two were head of the financial district of NXIVM, and Sarah and Claire were actually heiresses to the Seagram alcohol fortune. And so they had tons of money, and every time a lawsuit would come their way, they would simply just buy the lawsuit away or pay the people off not to say anything. And most of the time it unfortunately worked. But it wasn't until about 15 years after this organization had started that the curtain slowly lifted. There was a man by the name of Frank Parlato that was a publicist for the the NXIVM group, but once he started to do a little bit of digging on the group, he found out that there was a bunch of embezzlement going on done by Keith. And when Keith found out that Frank knew about the embezzlement, Keith literally just fired him. And at that point, it became his sole purpose to try to take this cult down. But unfortunately, as I said, since this group was so large and they also had a lot of money, a lot of their power and influence kind of spoke over Frank. That was until 2017, 19 years of this sex trafficking cult. That is when Sarah had finally made the decision to leave the group. This was also around the time where the hashtag #MeToo movement was gaining more traction, and Sarah decided to post a picture of her branding to social media. Now, this story catapulted, and Sarah even did a special with 2020. She did a special with Dateline, and she was on the cover of New York Times speaking about her story, speaking about the DOS group, and basically exposing everything that Keith and Nancy and Lauren were doing. And Sarah's story actually led so many other people within NXIVM to leave the group and also tell their stories. There were also other members of Sarah's pod that was coming out and showing their branding. And with all of this coming out, everyone was trying to take NXIVM down. Everybody was trying to research and figure out what actually was going on. And Keith was under so much fire because there's literally proof, like his initials are branded on women. Like there's no explanation in this world that you could give that would justify that. And so since Keith knew he was under a little bit of pressure, there was one guy in this group named Carlos Emilio Salinas, who was actually the son of the ex-president of Mexico, named Carlos Salinas, who was the president of Mexico from 1988 to 1994. Carlos told Keith, "Why don't you hide out in one of my houses in Mexico and just stay there until things start to cool down?" Keith took him, Nancy, Carlos, and a couple of other close members of the group, and they flew out to this villa in Mexico while things cooled off. But unfortunately for Keith, things never cooled off and things just got worse. And all of these things that were coming out were 10 times darker than anyone could have imagined. Times Union actually did a piece with a bunch of teenage girls who said that they were recruited into DOS and they were simply just recruited to be sexually assaulted. There was also this one girl who said that she was introduced to Keith when she was 12 years old because her mom was actually introduced about NXIVM. And when her mom and her daughter were being approached about NXIVM, they decided to give it a try. And it was said by this young girl that Keith said that he had an interest in the young girl. And over time, being in this cult, Keith had manipulated, brainwashed, and basically convinced this 12-year-old girl to have sex with him. And unfortunately, she did. And as I said, she was a young, vulnerable girl. So she was under the impression, because Keith was telling her that if she had sex with him, then she would get mystical powers. And he said that this was an honor to share intimacy with someone as great as him. Keith was actually later caught the following year in 2018 in his house in Mexico. And when the police showed up to arrest Keith, he was actually in the middle of a recommitment ceremony that him and his group were performing, but the group was performing this ceremony on Keith orally. And on May 7th, 2019, Keith's trial began, and the details of everything going on would just get so much darker. There were 3 sisters that testified at court that said that they were roped into this cult. Keith actually had this whole entire family underneath his wing. He had basically brainwashed this entire family to do whatever he wanted them to do. And Keith was unfortunately able to convince the parents for Keith to impregnate their first child, and he was successful in doing so. And so this young girl went on to have Keith's child, and Keith bought this family a whole house in Albany for this girl to give birth to his second child, actually, because Keith also had another kid with another woman in the group, but that woman later left and took the kid with her. The second sister said that she was groomed ever since she was 15 years old, and on her 18th birthday, that is when she had sex with Keith as a commitment ceremony. And the third sister said that she was groomed also when she was 15 years old, and she said that Keith would tell them things like if they had sex with him, they would get mystical powers, and if they had sex with anyone else, that means Keith would lose his powers, basically manipulating them to make them like feel bad, like, oh, I can't have sex with anyone else because I don't want to hurt Keith and his powers. And unfortunately, there would be times where Keith would also be intimate with two of the sisters at the same time. There are also hospital records to prove that all three of these girls had been pregnant with Keith's child at one point, but all three of the girls had gotten abortions. The third sister also said that she was forced into solitary confinement for 2 years in their house in Albany. She couldn't see her family. The only people that were allowed to see her was Keith, Lauren, and Nancy, and the reason why they put her in this house all by herself was because she had an interest in another guy. But Keith didn't tell the family that this was the reason she was in there. Keith told the family that they had proof of her stealing, and so she needed to be away from society in order for them to fix her. Even after the 2 years of solitary confinement, she didn't even get to see her family again. Keith had actually instructed her dad to drive her to the Mexican border and drop her off with only $80 and no identity, nothing. And so since the father was so brainwashed and mind controlled at that point by Keith, he agreed and he took his daughter to the border and just dropped her off. And that's when later on this girl was found, and then she went to court to testify against Keith. The abuse in this cult was so bad that there were multiple women that attempted at taking their lives, and there was 2 women that actually did. One of the women was Gina Hutchinson, who was found with a self-inflicted gunshot wound, and another woman named Kristen Snyder, who had been kicked out of a NXIVM event but then never seen again. Gina Hutchinson was 33 years old and came out about her story in NXIVM back in 2002. She told the press that she had been groomed by Keith since she was in the 8th grade, since she was 13, and at the time she was currently 23 when she left. She was described as very sweet, very compassionate, and she loved animals. And her sister even said that she had a very soothing and gentle soul to her, and so a gunshot wound to the head is something that she would not do. And she was actually found dead outside of a monastery in Woodstock, which was about an hour away from where Keith was. And Frank Parlato, the publicist that I was talking about earlier, actually did a special on NXIVM and conducted a study that showed that it would be physically impossible for Gina to reach the trigger of the shotgun at the angle she was shot at in the mouth. So Frank fully believes that it wasn't Gina that had shot herself. It was actually someone within the group that shot her. The second woman was Kristen Snyder, who was 30 years old and was an aspiring entrepreneur and an environmental consultant. She was described as very fun, loving, motivated, and she was all about self-improving and self-care, self-love, and so something like the NXIVM ESP program is, right up her alley. It's definitely something she's into. But on February 7th, 2003, she was called in missing, and the last time she was seen was a NXIVM seminar. Now, Kristen actually went to this NXIVM seminar with her wife, and when she was kicked out of the meeting, her wife didn't really think much of it. Her wife was just like, okay, Kristen's gonna go out there, she's gonna cool off, I'll see her tonight and we'll talk. But unfortunately, when she went home, Kristen never showed up. 2 days later, she was reported missing, and then her truck was found about 2.5 hours away, and inside was a suicide note. And within the suicide note, one of the lines read, quote, "No need to look for my body." In this note, she said that she was a part of a group called NXIVM that had completely stripped her of all of her sanity, and she now believes that her organs are rotting. Now, the place where her truck was found was near a lake area, and so there was a shed nearby that usually holds 2 kayaks and 2 paddles, but when they went in there, there was only 1 kayak and 1 paddle. So they assumed that maybe she had drowned in the lake, so they send out helicopters, dogs, divers, but they couldn't find any sight of Kristen, not even the paddle and the boat that was missing from the shed. And even Kristen's friends would go on to say that this was really unlike Kristen to do. But one of Kristen's friends that was also in NXIVM said that the part in the program where you have to strip away all of your fears and all of your anxieties and basically just like rewire yourself, this friend said that Kristen really was affected by this. And this friend noticed that Kristen was getting getting so bad that she actually went to one of the Grand Masters and said, you know, what should we do about Kristen? I don't think she's doing very well. And after this, nothing was done to Kristen. All they did was keep Kristen and the friends separated. But it would actually later come out in the trial that Keith hated lesbians because, as I said, he believed that a woman needed a man. And so it's believed that maybe Keith one day tried to do something to Kristen, and Kristen was not interested because she was gay. So she told him that she wasn't interested, and he got offended by this because how dare a woman not be interested in him? And so there had suspected to have been some involuntary sexual relations, and due to this, Kristen grew pregnant. And so Kristen went to the NXIVM seminar, and during the seminar she spoke out and yelled that he had made her pregnant and that it wasn't consensual. And due to this of her speaking out, she was exited out of the seminar and never seen again. There was also a handwriting expert that tried to compare the handwriting on the suicide note and a handwriting that they had, like Kristen had signed a Valentine's Day card, but it really wasn't enough for them to compare the two, so they don't really know if Kristen wrote this letter or not. And even to this day, Kristen's body was never found, so we really don't know what happened to her. Keith also had 2 long-term girlfriends who both were diagnosed with cancer and both unfortunately passed away, but Keith was ironically in charge of everyone's medical treatments, including the women's cancer treatments. And Keith was in control of the cancer treatments of not just these 2 women, but another woman. And this other woman left the group and she went to go to a real doctor to get cancer treatment. And when this doctor tested a strand of her hair actually tested positive for dangerous levels of bismuth and barium, which are very heavy metals, and thus made her cancer even worse. And then once she actually started to receive real treatment, her cancer got 10 times better. And so she believes that Keith had poisoned and killed those 2 other women because those 2 other women were also in their 40s. And so it's believed that Keith had told these 2 women that they had cancer and then poisoned them and killed them to make room for the younger women. Some women that testified said that they just felt like they were experiments for Keith's spiritual healing. And after all of this evidence was revealed, Keith was finally charged with a list of charges. He was charged with sexual exploitation of a minor, possession of CP, sex trafficking, attempted sex trafficking, identity theft because of all of the credit cards that he was using when people left the group, trafficking for labor and services, forced labor, conspiracy to alter records for use of the official proceeding, sex trafficking conspiracy, forced labor conspiracy, forced labor, racketeering conspiracy, and wire fraud conspiracy. And he was sentenced to 120 years. Allison, Mac, Claire, as well as Lauren and Sarah were all charged for their crimes as well. Allison was sentenced to 3 years in prison and 3 years probation and 1,000 hours of community service with a $20,000 fine. She was charged with racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking conspiracy, and forced labor conspiracy. Claire Boffman, who was Sarah's sister, was also charged with conspiracy to conceal and harbor illegal aliens for financial gain, fraudulent use of identity, and she was sentenced to 5 years in prison plus a $6 million fine. Nancy pled guilty to racketeering and racketeering conspiracy and was only sentenced to 3.5 years with a $150,000 fine, which let me stop real quick and say how insane that is. Nancy was just as responsible as Keith. Why is she getting a baby sentence? Her daughter Lauren was also charged, but she was able to actually wiggle her way out of jail and was only given 5 years probation and 300 hours of community service. And as far as the aftermath of everything, in September 30th, 2020, Claire's sentence had changed from 6 years to 9 months in prison, and she was fined $500 and is suspected to be released next year in 2025. July of 2023, Allison was actually released from prison and she only served 2 out of her 3-year sentence. And recently, actually, on September 7th of 2023, Nancy was released after only serving a year and a half of her 3.5-year sentence. Some news outlets actually say that Nancy was sent to a halfway house and she wasn't actually actually released, but when a news outlet had contacted this halfway house to get in contact with Nancy, they said that they don't know who Nancy is. Nancy has never been there, nor does she have any plans on being there. And as for Keith, he is still, thank God, in prison, serving out his 120-year life sentence, now being 63 years old. Claire is still also in prison as of 2024 and has not been released yet. But as for Sarah was very similar to Lauren, and she was able to wiggle her way out of jail with just some probation and community service hours. And yeah, that is the end of today's story. If you guys found this video interesting, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe. If you want to follow me on any of my socials like my Instagram, Pinterest, all of that will be linked down below, as well as my PO box if you want to send me anything. And yeah, I would love to hear what your guys' thoughts and opinions are about this case in the comments below. There is honestly a lot to unpack. I honestly think Lauren's sentence of 3.5 years is a joke, and I honestly think that her getting out only after a year and a half is a double joke. Nancy was right by side Keith since the very beginning. They were the ones that made NXIVM. They were the ones that made DOS. They are the ones that recruited members. They were in control of the entire operation. And it's very difficult because, you know, you think maybe Nancy was, you know, just manipulated and brainwashed and was just mind controlled into doing everything that she did. But at the same time, those actions are irreversible, and it is what it is. Like, she did do those things. She was aiding in sex trafficking. She was aiding in supplying women for Keith. Those bad things should receive extreme consequences because those things also affected dozens and dozens of other women in the process. Okay, so the last bit of audio cut out right here, but I'm basically just gonna summarize real quick what I said. At the end of the day, what Nancy did was a bad thing. This sex trafficking cult and going out and recruiting young women, lying to these innocent women, knowing in the back of her head exactly what she was doing and exactly what Keith was going to do to these women, that no matter where you spin it, how you spin it, is a bad thing, and bad things deserve consequences. A recent example of this is, I don't know if you guys have seen, but Gypsy Rose Blanchard recently just got released from prison. And she said in a recent interview, although there was a lot of abuse and a lot of factors that led to her doing what she did, and that thing was killing her mother, she could have went about it a different way. She could have went to the police, she could have went to the authorities, she could have done it a safer way, but at the end of the day, she did a bad thing, and she received consequences for those bad things.
You are not alone in this situation. There are other ways out. I did it the wrong way. No, you know.
Don't say that.
But I did.
No choice,
I did
really.
something wrong, and I paid my dues for it.
Oh, you mean that part?
Yes, the part of it. You know, that part of it. So I did something.
Murder is wrong.
Yes, murder is wrong.
And I feel like Nancy in this situation is no different. She did 20 years worth of bad things. She deserves more consequences than what she was given. And like, it's crazy to think that there are literally people out there who have been caught with just an ounce of weed and get 10 years in prison, while Nancy was organizing a sex cult for 20 years and just got a year and a half. And especially reeling in all of these little girls because they were minors, putting them into this cult, knowing exactly what Keith was going to do to them, and pursuing that for 20 years. That is bad. That is a crime, no matter how you look at it, where you look at it. Also, to bring justice to all those girls who even to this day have to go through so much because of what Nancy did to them. So yeah, that's basically what I said. Back to the video. But again, I would love to hear what you guys think in the comments below. Do you think Lauren deserved that sentence? Do you think she deserved a longer sentence? Do you believe that Sarah deserved jail time? Do you think it's right that Allison was already released, or do you also believe that she should serve more time? But yeah, again, that is all from me. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day today. Make sure to go outside if you can. I know in Chicago it's freezing cold, so I will not be going outside. Get some fresh air, look at the sun, look at the sky, stay hydrated, drink some water. Yeah, that is all from me. And as always, I love you, I love you, I love you. And I will see you guys next week. Bye.